We live in an era where millions of people seem to have lost the ability to think for themselves. Anxiety, depression, and stress are spreading at an alarming rate, driven by increasingly sophisticated mental manipulation techniques that exploit human fragility on a global scale. Understanding how this engineering operates is essential to protect our autonomy and recover the freedom to think. This reality doesn't emerge from nowhere. There's a conscious, complex, and persistent strategy to shape opinions and control minds. Only by knowing how these techniques operate can we escape the psychological siege that transforms individuals into predictable pieces of a system that profits from confusion. The journey to see this process is uncomfortable, but vital. Only those who recognize the traps can avoid them and live with true freedom, even when the majority prefers to ignore the signs pointing to the collective sickness that spreads silently. Our society displays increasingly clear signs of an ongoing psychological collapse. Anxiety has become epidemic, depression is growing among young people, and chronic stress has been normalized as if it were a natural part of modern life. These phenomena aren't isolated crises. Together, they form a silent emotional pandemic that erodes the capacity for discernment and strengthens control over entire populations. But why does this explosion of emotional diseases happen precisely now, in a period with technological advances never before seen, which theoretically should bring more comfort and well-being? How is it possible that a generation living with more material security and access to information than any other in history is so mentally ill? The answer goes beyond biological or individual factors. It lies in how the social, digital, and informational environment has been carefully shaped to exploit our fears, insecurities, and the deep desire for acceptance. These numbers aren't disconnected statistics. They're signs of a collective disturbance in the human mind. According to the Stress in America report from the American Psychological Association in 2022, more than 75% of young people report stress levels so high they harm their physical and mental health. This doesn't happen by chance. Those who can't deal with their own emotions become vulnerable, and this vulnerability is systematically cultivated by those who profit from confused and dependent populations. To illustrate, think about political campaigns that spread alarmist rumors just days before elections, provoking fear that paralyzes reasoning, or companies that use sensationalist advertising to create a sense of urgency, convincing people to buy products they don't need. These examples show how emotional strategies exploit weak points to manipulate on a large scale. Now imagine millions of individuals incapable of processing feelings in a healthy way. The result is a fragile, confused mass desperate for simple explanations to complex problems, creating the ideal scenario for those who wish to impose convenient narratives and limit individual freedom. This collective vulnerability creates the perfect ground for manipulation, because emotionally unstable people are much easier to influence than those who maintain self-control. It's as if all of society transformed into fertile soil for the seeds of control, because whoever dominates emotions also dominates choices. Each anxious, depressed, or stressed mind represents a strategic opportunity for those who know how to exploit this fragility. And the more individuals are dominated by fear and confusion, the more the effect spreads, feeding a vicious cycle of psychological dependence that spreads in silent waves. This collective mental illness isn't just a health problem, it's also a social and political problem. Emotionally fragile people make bad decisions, choose inadequate leaders, and accept solutions that only worsen their problems, creating a cycle that further strengthens the chaos in which they feel trapped. This pattern of illness and manipulation feeds the sensation of hopelessness and the conviction that there's no way out, which makes people even more susceptible to those who promise easy solutions. The dynamic is simple but powerful. The more chaotic society becomes, the more people beg for someone who promises to restore order, even if it costs their freedom and ability to think critically. But who are those offering these quick and comforting solutions? And why do their proposals almost always require that we hand over part of our autonomy in exchange for promises of stability? The great secret is that those in power discovered long ago that controlling confused people is much easier than dealing with lucid and confident individuals. That's why there's now a true industry of psychological manipulation, fed by studies on human behavior and technologies that allow personalizing each message to hit the mind with surgical precision. This industry manifests in advertising campaigns, political speeches, and viral content on social networks, all constructed to provoke intense emotions, reduce critical capacity, and guide the masses in the desired direction. Techniques that were once restricted to interrogations or brainwashing processes are now applied subtly to entire populations, disguised as entertainment, opinion, or neutral information. They seem harmless, but are extremely effective at undermining mental autonomy. It's a process that appropriates our fear of being left out, the desire to belong, and the need for quick answers in a complex world. The fabrication of collective delusions doesn't happen by chance. It's a carefully planned process, sustained by increasingly refined persuasion techniques based on scientific knowledge about how the human mind works. Those who manipulate know exactly which triggers to activate to provoke the desired reactions and ensure that people believe their ideas are the fruit of their own reflection, even when they're just conditioned responses to carefully orchestrated stimuli. They study psychology, neuroscience, and behavior to perfect their techniques. Not by chance, there are research centers specialized in influencing masses. Edward Bernays, considered the father of modern public relations, showed how the discoveries of his uncle, Sigmund Freud, could be used to systematize the manipulation of public opinion and transform it into a true science of influence, knowledge that became even more powerful in the digital age. Modern propaganda is no longer crude like the posters or slogans of old dictatorships. Today, it's subtle, sophisticated, and almost invisible. It doesn't require you to believe immediately, just that you stop questioning. This silent approach is much more effective because it builds acceptance without provoking conscious resistance. While old slogans shouted orders, contemporary propaganda whispers suggestions, infiltrated into every corner of our daily lives. It's embedded in the entertainment we watch, the news we read, the content we share, and even the informal conversations we have. The distortion of reality occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly, until the lie becomes more comfortable than the truth. Thus, people don't realize their perception has been shaped. They believe their opinions are original when, in practice, they're the result of calculated influences. A good practical example is how series and films, in many cases, insert political or behavioral views into exciting narratives, naturalizing certain ideas. Another is the use of memes and jokes that go viral on social networks, transforming complex concepts into simplifications that shape public opinion with humor, apparently innocent but loaded with direction. This subtlety makes millions repeat viewpoints without ever questioning the origin or who benefits from their adoption. It's like wearing glasses with slightly colored lenses. After a while, you forget you're wearing them and start seeing the world only in that color. This metaphor precisely illustrates how collective perception can be shaped without conscious resistance. The final objective isn't just to sell a product or promote a politician, but to shape how people perceive reality, form beliefs, and make decisions. It's a project to control consciousnesses, not just superficial opinions. When this happens on a large scale, all of society can be led where the manipulators want, without people realizing it. And most alarming, they believe they're thinking freely when they're actually following a carefully written script, choosing between options they never defined, but that were presented as if they were their only alternatives. It's as if freedom were limited to choosing between predetermined paths, while true autonomy, that of questioning the paths themselves, was silently suffocated. But how did these techniques evolve to such sophistication? The internet revolutionized the game of mental manipulation. Before, those who wanted to influence the masses needed to invest fortunes in newspapers, radio, or television, media controlled by few and requiring privileged access. Today, anyone with a smartphone is connected to a global network where each click reveals more about their fears, desires, and insecurities than they themselves imagine. Social networks have become the most powerful tools of psychological control ever created. Their algorithms analyze each user movement with almost unimaginable detail, discovering what they want to see, hear, and believe, often before they themselves notice their emotional states. They know when you're happy, sad, anxious, or angry. They know what makes you click, share, get outraged, or fall in love. Then, they feed you content that reinforces your beliefs, isolating you in information bubbles tailor-made. This process creates the illusion that everyone thinks alike, when in reality, each person lives in a personalized reality. This fragmentation makes each individual inhabit their own universe, reinforcing divisions and making healthy social consensus difficult. It's as if society were transformed into a mosaic of isolated emotional bubbles, each trapped in their artificially reinforced certainties, unable to dialogue with other views. The speed with which the internet spreads information also amplifies the force of this manipulation. A piece of news, whether true or false, can spread to millions in a matter of hours, triggering mass emotional reactions before any critical reflection is possible. Reflection is replaced by reflex. People share, comment, and take sides in seconds without analyzing the context or veracity of the content. How many times have you shared something just because of the title or a quick impression? How many times have you formed an opinion about a complex topic after watching a short video or reading a sensationalist headline? This speed isn't just a byproduct of technology. It's intentionally exploited to reduce critical capacity, because the faster you react, the less time you have to think. The objective of those who control these tools is simple: concentrate influence and reduce resistance to their narratives. When all information passes through platforms controlled by few, directing what people will think, feel, and do becomes a much easier task. The diversity of perspectives is lost in a sea of opinions shaped by algorithms that reinforce whatever captures attention most, regardless of whether it's truth or lies. This dynamic characterizes a modern form of social control that dispenses with the use of physical force. To dominate, it's enough to control the flow of information, because the human mind, when bombarded by emotional stimuli, seeks quick shortcuts to feel safe. And most surprising is that many people voluntarily hand over this power, believing they're gaining something in return, like social acceptance, validation, or the sensation of belonging. But why do we give up our autonomy so easily? Most intriguing is that no one needs to force people to give up the freedom to think. They do it themselves, convinced they're making the best decisions. And the more secure they are in their choices, the more faithful they become to the narratives that trap them. This is the greatest power of well-executed manipulation, transforming each individual into an active accomplice of their own limitation. This process exploits basic human needs. We all seek security, acceptance, and belonging. Influencers, by offering exactly that, ask in return that you surrender your independent thinking, because whoever controls your identity controls your decisions. The seductive discourse usually comes accompanied by phrases like, "Trust us, and we'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry." For those living in constant anxiety or loneliness, this promise of relief seems irresistible, an easy way out to avoid the pain of emotional discomfort. Collective mentality is essential for this mechanism to work. When we see others accepting the same conditions, we feel pressure to act the same way, because the fear of social exclusion is one of the most potent instruments of psychological coercion. No one wants to be the only one to disagree or walk against the crowd. It's much more comfortable to follow the flow, even if it leads to destructive paths, because the human mind fears isolation more than the consequences of being wrong. The fear of appearing different is so intense that it overcomes even the fear of being mistaken. This dangerous inversion makes individual freedom viewed with distrust, when it should be celebrated as an essential value. Gradually, people begin to fear the responsibility that accompanies freedom, starting to consider it a burden instead of an inalienable right. The comfort of having someone decide for them becomes more attractive than facing the discomfort of thinking autonomously. This shift in perception makes the voluntary surrender of control over one's own mind become not only possible, but desirable for millions. It's a silent but devastating trade that corrodes society from within. This process doesn't occur by chance. It's driven by three psychological triggers that exploit vulnerable points in our behavior. The first trigger is fear. When it arises, the capacity to reason plummets because the brain enters self-preservation mode and seeks immediate solutions, even if they're illusory or ineffective. This reaction, essential in survival environments like jungles or battlefields, today transforms into a powerful weapon against ourselves. Think about how sensationalist news about crimes, crises, or pandemics generate mass panic, making people accept extreme measures without questioning, just to relieve anxiety. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to think clearly when you're very worried? How your heart races, your hands sweat, and your mind just wants to escape the problem? This is exactly the state that manipulators want to provoke, because scared people accept orders easily. In this scenario, any information that offers immediate relief is embraced, regardless of its veracity. Momentary comfort takes precedence over the search for truth. The second trigger is confusion. When we're disoriented, we desperately seek explanations to recover a sense of control. In this state, any narrative that seems coherent, even if absurd, is accepted because the mind hates uncertainties. It's like being lost in a dark forest. You'd follow any voice that claims to know the way, even without being sure of its reliability. This urgent need for clarity makes people dependent on those who promise to decipher chaos, creating a vulnerability exploited in speeches that offer simple answers to complex questions. The third trigger is the desire for security. After fear and confusion, a deep longing for protection is born, something that manipulators understand very well. They offer solutions that seem to be the only way out, but that always demand individual concessions, like giving up freedoms, accepting narratives without questioning, or submitting to supposedly saving leaders. Each concession seems small in isolation, but added up across millions of people, they hand collective control to few. Imagine how, in times of political or economic instability, authoritarian leaders emerge promising stability in exchange for obedience. It's the cycle that repeats throughout history, but now enhanced by technology, which allows amplifying fear, confusion, and the desire for security with instant and personalized reach. These three triggers are so powerful because they can be intentionally activated, and frequently are, in processes that follow an efficient pattern, cycles of tension and relief. In them, first a climate of apprehension is created, often with alarmist headlines, somber predictions, or exaggerated alerts. Then, a solution is offered that requires individual concessions, accompanied by reassuring speeches. When people accept, they experience relief, and the process repeats, tightening the grip on individual freedom more and more. This technique is so effective because it exploits the human tendency to accept gradual changes that would be unacceptable if imposed all at once. It's the famous frog in the pot. If placed in boiling water, it jumps immediately. But if the water is heated gradually, it remains until it dies. With societies, the principle is the same. Restrictions imposed slowly don't generate immediate revolt, but accustom the population to losing freedom without noticing. Each new cycle of tension and relief makes people surrender more autonomy in exchange for a false sense of security. Over time, they become so accustomed to the state of dependence that the simple idea of freedom causes discomfort because it requires effort, reflection, and responsibility, attributes that many lose when they settle into passivity. What was once unthinkable becomes acceptable, then normal, and soon seems mandatory without noticing the change. This cultural transformation is so slow and silent that many don't even realize their opinions were shaped to legitimize submission. And when someone questions, they're quickly silenced or marginalized, because the already conditioned mass reacts as guardian of the status quo. Collective pressure then becomes one of the most powerful instruments for maintaining the cycle of control. The perpetuation of this cycle depends on a crucial detail: the constant generation of crises. When one threat loses force, another is soon created or amplified, ensuring that people remain in a state of chronic anxiety. This strategy prevents emotional recovery and blocks critical reflection because the permanently scared and confused mind seeks only to survive the next imminent problem. Think about how successive scandals or political crises are reported without pause in news cycles. Before one controversy is clarified, another already occupies the headlines, keeping everyone busy, outraged, or worried. At this frantic pace, few have energy to analyze what's actually happening. It's easier to react than reflect, and that's exactly what manipulators expect. This succession of crises creates a society in constant vigilance, always waiting for the next shakeup. In this state, individual freedom seems dangerous because the mind dominated by fear prefers quick certainties, even if they cost autonomy. The dependence on ready-made solutions, sold as unique, grows with each cycle, weakening society from within and strengthening those who control the narratives. But why do isolated people become even more vulnerable? Separating individuals has always been one of the most effective strategies for exercising control. When isolated, people lose their support networks and become much more susceptible to external narratives, because the fear of not belonging makes them eager for any group that accepts them. This isolation doesn't need to be physical. It can be emotional, intellectual, or social, built silently by dynamics that discourage authentic dialogues and healthy disagreements. Modern isolation is subtle and dangerous. It's not just about staying home. It's feeling disconnected even when surrounded by people. It's being afraid to express doubts and insecurities, believing that no one else shares these feelings. When we stop talking sincerely, questioning and sharing our uncertainties, we become easy targets for those who want to influence us, because silence makes each person believe they're alone in their perceptions. How many times have you had an opinion that seemed to clash with everyone's, but preferred to stay quiet to avoid conflict? How many times did you convince yourself you were wrong just because no one else expressed the same doubts? This self-imposed silence is fertile ground for the passive acceptance of ideas that in an environment of open dialogue could be challenged and clarified. When people isolate themselves, they lose the chance to strengthen their critical thinking. Because this skill develops precisely in the confrontation of different ideas, in active listening and in reflection provoked by divergent viewpoints. Without this, the mind becomes rigid, incapable of sustaining responsibility for its own freedom. It's like a muscle that, without use, atrophies until it becomes incapable of fulfilling its function. Isolation also distorts the perception of reality. Without balanced external references, the mind amplifies fears, certainties, and paranoias. Extreme ideas thrive in closed environments where there's no counterpoint. The more homogeneous the group, the more radical the ideas can become, because the lack of dialogue reinforces beliefs that would never survive honest collective analysis. This combination of isolation, fear, and confusion generates another worrying phenomenon: psychological regression. When fragile people feel incapable of facing the world's challenges alone, they tend to behave like children, seeking authority figures to decide for them. This emotional dependence makes adults act like immature beings, abdicating their own judgment in exchange for illusory protection. You can notice this in daily life when people say phrases like, "I don't want to think about this," "I'll wait for what the experts say," or when they accept contradictory rules just because they came from sources considered trustworthy. Carl Jung warned that, by merging with the group, the individual drastically reduces their intellectual and moral level, because sustaining one's own individuality requires courage, effort, and responsibility. And many prefer to give this up to avoid the weight of autonomous thinking. This regression isn't just an individual problem. When millions of people go through it simultaneously, all of society becomes vulnerable to increasingly radical influences. Worse still, when regression mixes with ideological fervor, it creates an environment where hatred can be seen as virtue and violence as heroism, legitimizing attitudes that would previously be considered inconceivable. To illustrate, just remember extremist movements that take advantage of the desperation and isolation of their members, offering belonging in exchange for blind obedience, or cults that promise absolute protection in exchange for the total surrender of critical thinking. These extreme examples show how the fragile mind, when captured, can be led to support actions it would never consider in times of emotional balance. The only way out of this labyrinth is to regain control of one's own mind. This doesn't mean ignoring fears or pretending strength. It means stopping outsourcing thinking, taking responsibility for one's own reflections and seeking information from various sources, confronting them to build a broader and more realistic vision. It requires courage to face the discomfort of disagreeing, to accept that we'll often be alone in our convictions, and that this isn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. Genuine freedom is born from self-knowledge, self-control, and the conscious decision to act despite fear. When you decide to walk this path, you discover you're much stronger than you imagined. Each step toward autonomy reinforces the only true security: confidence in yourself, a confidence that doesn't depend on external approvals or imposed narratives. This choice isn't easy or quick. It's a daily exercise of attention, analysis, and questioning. But each moment you choose to think for yourself strengthens the capacity to resist the pressures that want to shape your ideas. Only this way is it possible to recover lucidity amid chaos, maintain sanity in a world that profits from confusion, and conquer a freedom that no one can take away from you.